All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the live chat for January 11th, 2023. Hope everyone can hear me, see me okay. Good, yes. Um, where could we begin? Well, as you know, it has been a mild stretch for this winter. We've had to deal with a polar vortex that has consolidated. We have dealt with a very unusual environment in the Pacific where this jet streak, which I'll show in just a moment, that has been dominating our weather pattern really is more like something you would see in a strong El Nino rather than a strong or moderate or any type of La Nina event. Usually, what happens is that you'll get an enhanced subtropical jet stream, and then you get this string of storms slamming into the western United States, leading to widespread heavy rainfall. La Nina usually leads to a weak subtropical jet stream, more of an enhanced polar jet stream, higher potential for a ridge on the west coast, and certainly not what we're seeing now. So this is not a pattern that I would normally see in a traditional La Nina. So that has been confounding me a bit. And I think part of that evolution that we're seeing is based on the sea surface temperature anomalies, which I'll talk about in a moment. And we'll walk through that idea where the thermal gradient is leading to this enhancement in the winds, and absent of any support from the stratosphere, from weakening of the polar vortex to disrupt that evolution, we've ended up with basically these strings of storms moving through. So it's very unusual. And let me just show you the water vapor right now that is set up where we have storm after storm coming into the west coast, very El Nino like. And this storm in particular, which we're going to be watching out for tomorrow evening into Friday morning, where this storm could be producing some very impressive rainfall, half an inch to inch and a half of rain in a short period of time. I'm more concerned about the strong wind gusts, which we'll get into as well. But do not lose hope. Do not lose hope in the idea of winter. I know that everyone wants to cancel winter, which, by the way, I just have one question about that. How come no one ever cancels summer? I mean, personally, I'm not up with the heat and humidity, so I would love to see some posts about canceling summer and us having cool conditions. Never see that happening. Be nice if it did. But no, it's not time yet to cancel winter. Certainly, the pattern has not evolved the way I thought it would, and we all know why. We discussed why that is the case. So now that we've learned where we've been and what caused the pattern to get where we are now, where are we going from here on out? So tonight, I want to talk about that and some of the ideas I have in this evolution. And some of these ideas I've bounced off of individuals like Dr. Cohen, who has an outstanding public blog about the polar vortex and what he sees as possibly evolving. We have some differences in opinion on the potential for a major stratospheric warming event. He was a little bit more aggressive than I was. I don't really see the data for it, but I certainly see plenty of support for stretching of the polar vortex. So we'll talk about that and some of the observations we're seeing. But first, let's look at this jet streak. Now, compared to last week, we have seen some significant changes starting to evolve. And this is why I'm more confident in a pattern change evolving and the change in the stretch of the polar vortex because of the observations we're seeing. Last week, this was a fire hose from China all the way to the west coast. Now we're starting to see that wave action. Okay, someone's grabbed the ropes and started to shake this little bugger. And so as a result, we're starting to see these troughs and ridges showing up and disruption in this fire hose that has been slamming into the West Coast. And what that means is that there's more support for amplification. More amplification leads to better potential of bringing a lot of cold air that is building up in Siberia and sending it towards North America. Now, I wanted to show you what type of cold air are we dealing with. Well, let's take a look at the surface here. And this is some brutally cold air back up here. Minus 33.9 degrees Celsius. And this is at the surface. Okay, these are the temperatures. Minus 50 degrees Celsius at the surface in Siberia. So this cold pool is building up. And the reason why this is important is because what happens is that it produces this ridge and it starts to set up to disrupt the upper troposphere and then the stratosphere as it continues to build up, as its mass builds up. So as the mass builds up, it starts to warp the polar vortex. And that buildup of mass turns into stratospheric warming that we start to see in the model guidance, because you're building up the mass at the top here, and you're building up the differences in the mass, and you're allowing for that compression and that warming to take place. And so that is a starting point for our stratospheric disruption and stretching. So the stretching of the polar vortex allows for this cold air to start to head south. And so it can cross the Arctic Circle. And then you could have locations like in northern Canada where it's minus 39 degrees Celsius, which is pretty cold. That is able to stretch and move down towards North America. But until that happens, our Pacific air mass continues to march across, and our Pacific air mass leads to very mild conditions and temperatures in the 50s. And a lot of people, especially up who like to go skiing, rather disappointed. So we know where we've been, we know where we're at right now, and we see what that potential could lead to. And when you have a stretching in the polar vortex starting to evolve, and you'll start to see that here in our 3D vortex, you can see the stretching taking place here. Now let's move this to a different position so you could see it a little bit better. So here's North America, and you can see it's kind of stretching down towards North America and getting warped. Okay, so that's the 3D view of this. So you're warping this feature, and then you're supporting the transport of all that Arctic air heading towards North America. So anyone who's saying that winter is canceled or over might be in for a bit of a surprise as we head towards the last week of January and through at least the first half of February. So with this, what do we say about tropical forcing? Well, let's take a look at some of our data here. Our La Nina is still trucking along. The support at the subsurface is fading away, but you still have it at the surface, and you still have your convection struggling to fire here around the date line. But we are at the point now where right now we're in a neutral state in what would be considered phase 7 and 8. The model guidance strongly supports a shift towards phases 1, 2, and 3, 8, 1, 2, and 3, but it's relatively weak. So what this tells me is that the tropical forcing is no longer going to fight this evolution. And this gradient that supported our jet streak is going to become less of a factor. So, in other words, the tropical forcing that was basically led to a very mild pattern here is about to collapse. And we're about to see a pretty significant change in the SOI, because as we go into phases 8, 1, 2, and 3, you're going to see a lot more negative contributions from our SOI. And what that means is that the pressure and wind factors that supported La Nina are going to crash. And we're seeing that rapid crash already the past couple of days, where we're up in the 30s and upper 20s, and now we're crashing towards the single digits, and then eventually negative state, which will cause this feature right here to weaken rapidly. So I'm trying to show you the changes are happening right now in the observations. This isn't a model solution 10 days away or 15 days away. This is happening now. And to just kind of make that point, our EP flux in the observations now are starting to support that stretching and that warping that we're looking for in the polar vortex. So remember what I said a week ago. Around the 15th is going to be make or break for the winter forecast in terms of the rest of the winter. If we saw on the 15th no support of any type of change in the tropics and no weakening of the polar vortex and no signs of any disruption, then winter would be dead. Because then you just keep your strong polar vortex and nothing would really change until maybe late February and March, when no one wants that to happen because then everyone's ready for spring and baseball, right? So we're seeing it happening now on the 11th in the observations. And where does that take us? Well, take a look at this. Look at this factor here. Whenever you have your arrows getting longer here and pointing towards 90 degrees north, towards the high latitudes, what this means is that you're getting the warm air in the mid latitudes transported towards the polar vortex. This supports that disruption. So when we went warm, this was nowhere near the high latitudes, and there was no transport whatsoever from the mid latitudes. What does that look like in heat flux? Well, let's take a look. Here's the observation right now. You can already see it starting. Very warm air. Let's see where we go forward here. And you can see that evolution getting stronger and stronger. So what does that look like in the model guidance? Well, as you can see, there's our stretching starting to take shape and possibly even maybe a slight split. But this right here, this evolution takes that Arctic air that's building in Siberia and sends it towards North America. And if we take a look at the upper level winds at 100 millibars, you can see that cross-polar flow starting to develop. And if we go and let me reset this here for a second. Take a look at North America, 300 millibar winds. You can see that cross-polar flow starting to develop. And your support for colder air to sink in towards the eastern North America. You also see that very nicely supported now in the operational European guidance, operational GFS guidance, although to be honest, GFS is having some struggling issues. I read the WPC discussion. They're leaning away from the GFS because it's having some convective issues. So I pretty much leaned on a mix of the Canadian and European guidance in tonight's forecast. But you can kind of see where the GFS is going, and then where the European ensembles here is going. Where you're getting above normal heights on the west coast, below normal heights on the east coast. Now, a bit of a caveat here. In this pattern, I do not see right now a strong negative NAO pattern. So this again is a warning in terms of winter storms that it is unwise, even in this pattern that's developing, to trust any solution beyond 5 days. in terms of snowfall maps, stuff like that, because it's still going to rely on how the short waves interact. And unfortunately, we're under the same limiting factor that we had in December, where if the short waves don't interact just right, you might miss out. So I'm just putting that out there right now so you understand what the limitations are in this pattern. I don't see a strong negative NAO block. I see a weak one. This could be interesting. If this feature ends up more like down here, then that's your 50-50 low, and then your storm track is basically through the mid-Atlantic coastal waters and hello snowstorms. However, if this feature's still right back here in an individual storm, then you open up the potential for storm tracks along the coastal plain or out into the Atlantic. In other words, either a rainstorm or a miss altogether, because your blocking is displaced to the east. So I just wanted to put that out there so that way people understand what our range is, from the potential returning to some very cold conditions and the potential for snowstorms. But if the high latitude blocking is off by just a little bit, then we might miss these storms. And it's just as cold and dry. So I wanted to put that out there so that way everyone understands where we're going here. Okay, this isn't a slam dunk pattern. This isn't a situation where it's a perfect snow pattern and everything's going to work out great and everyone's going to have above normal snowfall for the rest of the winter. I can't say that, but I can say winter is definitely not canceled. Now, the question beyond this point, and I'm going to reset this and pull up the GFS guidance. In fact, here, hold it. Let me go here because I wanted to talk about the temperature potential here. So this is the GFS ensembles, and let's talk about this potential for stratospheric warming. Now, the GFS is far more aggressive than the other guidance in this potential. But if you can establish this, the one reason why I can't 100% rule out a major stratospheric warming event is that cold dome would definitely support this type of evolution. That cold dome in Siberia. And if you end up with that major stratospheric warming event, you basically support cold weather conditions all the way through early March. Now, Dr. Cohen mentioned this in his discussion. I actually shared it on Twitter. You can also find Judah Cohen's Twitter feed. Excellent resource to study. This winter will basically evolve in three different potentials. And I like how he put it. You can either have a stretch and a slight warming that would extend it through mid-February, or a major stratospheric warming event, which basically means you have the potential for winter storms all the way through March 15th. And which then after that, the sun angle really causes havoc with any type of snow forecast. The reason why I'm not confident in the major stratospheric warming idea is only because the way that the transport has been evolving this winter, there has been no indication to support the weakening of the upper level winds and a reversal of the upper level winds. I really haven't seen that. That's why I really like the idea of a stretch, because it fits the current theme of the stratosphere and the upper tropospheric interaction for this winter. A major stratospheric warming event would be a departure from what we've been seeing over the past 6 weeks. So that's why it's almost like trying to follow fool's gold. Okay, it's trying to find real gold and a whole bunch of fool's gold and a lot of misdirection. And if you're in an environment that really hasn't supported that type of change and that type of weakening, then it's important to give your public and your clients a realistic view on this situation. This is why I like the stretching idea and the cold weather pattern through the middle of February. And then after that, it's a bit of a question. We could moderate pretty quickly, or we can continue on depending on how long the stretching takes place. The GFS solution is showing the same evolution here, a little bit more aggressive, in fact. And the European, out to 10 days, it's not as aggressive, but certainly supports the stretching idea that I'm talking about. So the key thing to understand here is that the support for stratospheric interaction with the polar vortex and the stretching of the polar vortex is going to happen. The return to more of a winter-like pattern is going to happen. The support for winter storms will return. Whether or not that is realized to actual significant snowfall for the region, I don't know yet. No one does. And for God's sakes, do not trust the 15 to 45 day snowfall forecast that I'm seeing floating around to get people excited. Those things, you might as well take a dartboard, get some darts, throw it at the dartboard, and call that your forecast. Because they're useless. They're used for hype. It's not meant for anything other than that. So, that's where we are right now in terms of the pattern. In terms of our storm setting up for Thursday night into Friday, pretty strong PVA rotating through. Let me go right to midnight here. Okay. So I'm going to zoom in here. This is around 1 a.m. on Friday morning. This jet streak has my attention because you're going to be dealing with strong PVA, strong lifting, strong mixing in the atmosphere, and you're going to have heavy rainfall moving through during this time period. So I don't think it's being advertised enough, but I think that this has significant potential for a sustained wind to 15 to 30 miles per hour, and then the evolution for wind gusts pushing over 40 miles per hour. So I'm not really seeing a lot of that in the news being advertised. So I just want to let you guys know, if you have anything that is loose outside, decorations, whatnot, I'd get them in before tomorrow night. I do think that there will be the potential for some minor wind damage. I wouldn't rule out a few power outages here and there either. So I would just be prepared for that with these wind gusts coming through. Rainfall amounts about half an inch to inch and a half at most. That's what I'm expecting in a short period of time. And it's showing up pretty nicely here on the NAM guidance. And let's see here. There we go. Let me refresh this, make sure we got the latest data. And on the NAM, it's showing up pretty nicely too. Now, we got this first wave via warm air transport, which also shows up pretty nicely here on the model and the radar, should I say. We could see some rain and snow showers, maybe even a little bit of grapple. I'm not really expecting much in the way of any type of significant precipitation between tonight and tomorrow afternoon, but I can't rule out a few pesky rain and snow showers. And then here comes our heavier rainfall coming through around midnight into the early morning hours. And again, I would just be aware of that wind gust. And I'm looking anywhere between a half an inch and an inch and a half of rain out of this. And then the idea of any type of flurries. Yeah, you have a slight chance of seeing some flurries here, especially in the Poconos and Catskills. I think this is a little bit overdone in Pittsburgh, but it's supported by an upper level low that's swinging on through. But I want to stress, I don't expect any type of accumulated snowfall out of this in this situation. So that's pretty much everything I have for tonight. I am going to now go and answer all of your questions. I'm like, wow, we are very busy tonight. A lot of great questions. And let me check out, make sure everything's working well on YouTube. And it is. Holy smokes. Okay, so we got a lot to answer for. So let's go and dive into this and answer some of your questions. Okay, let's see. Let's roll all the way back here. And good evening, everyone. And okay, that jet streak looks like one from last Super Nino. I agree. Let me pull this up here. We'll go back to winds. We'll go 250. Yeah, I mean, this is something I typically see in El Ninos. Not typical for La Ninas. I mean, this is great news for California because God knows they need the rain. But at the same time, let me just say, it'd be nice if, those in California and the Southwest, knowing that you're in a drought, could find better ways of capturing a lot of this rainfall and not letting it go to waste. But what do I know? I'm not a politician. This is not normal. No, I would agree with you. I would agree that this is definitely not normal. It's not. I knew going into this winter, and I must have said this about 1 billion times in terms of the confidence I had in the winter forecast. Remember, I said it was pretty low because I wasn't sure about how the interaction with the above normal water vapor in the atmosphere at the mid-latitudes in the southern hemisphere was going to mess around with what we traditionally would expect with a winter weather pattern, with a La Nina that is expected to weaken. And thus far, it hasn't acted anything like a La Nina. It didn't act like a La Nina during the tropical season. Remember the increase in vertical wind shear and the inhibiting influence on tropical cyclones when we were expecting to have a historic above normal season. Didn't exactly happen, now did it? We didn't see that the typical La Nina in the fall, and the winter has been all over the place, from Arctic blast to El Nino-like pattern. So I would agree, this is not normal. It's completely chaotic. And you can include influences from the volcano, influences from global warming, all of that. Yes, it's all a factor. 10 millibar vortex looks a bit stronger, but also a stronger feed from the mid-latitudes, from the tropics. All right, let's go to 10 millibars. All right, so, there we go. So it's still very well developed, pretty good evolution here. This feature right here is what's going to set up our disruption. And it's starting to get a little bit stronger. And what you're going to see over the next 7 days is this feature, which looks like a donut, becoming stretched. And you're starting to see that evolution starting right here. Very, very slight. When we go down to 70 millibars, it shows up a little bit better. You're already starting to see a slight split here, 2 lobes, starting to get that elongated look to it. So you're starting to see that evolution take place. But it is because of this influence is how we lost all our Arctic air in late December. Siberia is extremely cold. Question: does that air come across the pole to the U.S. and eventually to our area, or does it miss us? Okay, so the stretching of the polar vortex and the orientation of it will dictate exactly where this Siberian air will go. But there's a lot of research in which that when you get this type of very powerful cold air and you get the stretching that we're expecting, where you can get this northwesterly flow. Let me pull that up again. Where are you? There you are. Okay. So when you end up in this scenario here, we can get this northwesterly flow crossing the poles like this. That tends to take your Arctic air and drop it towards the Hudson Bay, the Great Lakes, and the eastern United States. Now, in terms of influence, well, let's just say if anyone's around the Great Lakes, be prepared for some major lake effect snowfall threats returning to Buffalo, Cleveland, a lot of Ohio, Michigan. It's going to get pretty nasty, I think. In terms of potential winter storms for us, it increases the potential, but doesn't lock anything in. The orientation, if the polar vortex stretches, basically this lobe ends up in Europe and this lobe ends up in the Pacific, if that happens, then basically we get warm. But if the orientation's like this, or if it shifts even more so to here and heads towards Quebec in that orientation, then we get all the Arctic air to come in. Typically, this type of stretching has very limited impact on Europe, and more so on North America. Okay, when you show the polar vortex, I see blue over PA, but then red colors take over. Does that mean that turned colder will not last long? I'm not sure how to read it. Thanks. Okay, this isn't temperatures. What this is heights at the stratospheric level. Now, this is a great question because it's a matter of understanding the differences here in the pattern. When you set up the heights in relation to the troposphere, it's not always a one-to-one correlation. When you have a decrease in heights in the stratosphere, what happens is that the column decreases. Now remember, you can't expand or contract from space. So it's kind of like an accordion. It comes in like this and allows for heights to build up in the troposphere. So what happens is that under here, you can get above normal heights. Under here, you get below normal heights. Now, then you get this feature here, and this is where it kind of gets a little convoluted, because sometimes what happens is that you can get a ridge axis building here, and this ridge axis here is a reflection of what's happening in the troposphere. So this is where I say it's not always a one-to-one correlation or a perfect correlation. What you're essentially seeing here is the differences in heights in the stratospheric level. Does not necessarily correlate to the temperature anomalies that you could expect under this regime. What I like to do when I'm looking at this is not so much looking at the heights here, but what I'm looking for is the orientation. So when I'm seeing the orientation, what this shows me is the wind flow around this orientation. So if it's taking me from Siberia into North America, the idea I have is that it's more likely to transport that cold air from Siberia towards North America. Is it definite that El Nino will develop, and will it be strong or weak? I'm still working on La Nina. I have no idea what to expect for El Nino if it should develop next summer. There is some support for a weak La Nina to take shape by the spring, but there is a lot of volatility in that forecast, and there's a lot of question on how fast that evolves. The subsurface currently doesn't support El Nino developing. We don't really have any support from wind factors either. You could make a case via the QBO transitioning that we could move towards an El Nino pattern. But right now, there is so much unknown that it's really irresponsible to go try to forecast the strength of El Nino or the timing going forward. I would say all options are on the table for right now for El Nino over the next 12 months. Now, typically, after a triple dip La Nina, you typically end up historically with a weak to moderate El Nino that follows. But again, we're not dealing with a typical evolution in the pattern to begin with for a variety of reasons, as we discussed. What are the states of the QBO and AAM? What impacts are they having? Well, we could do the AAM real fast. Let's see here. Angular momentum. For anyone who doesn't know, that's atmospheric angular momentum. And we'll pull up the EPS. And right now, it's been predominantly negative. Here's the forecast, remaining negative. So this would tell us that it's more likely when you have positive phases, the pattern tends to act more like El Nino. When you have negative phases, it tends to act more like La Nina in terms of the potential for high latitude blocking. Now, this is what I was talking about in terms of the pattern just being kind of loopy. Because when you take a look at this data, okay, like the GFS data and whatnot, it would suggest to me that, hey, look, we should have more La Nina-like influences. But what we've been dealing with and what we've been continuing to struggle with, and let me pull this up, is that after going into a positive phase that would support our El Nino-like conditions, we've seen now more support for La Nina-like conditions, i.e. that strong jet streak that we've been seeing in the Pacific is losing support. So the AAM has been a bit loopy because the lifting parameters and forcing parameters in the atmosphere have not been behaving the way that they should in a La Nina pattern. But we are starting to see those changes and more of a suggestion of more amplification of the polar jet stream. When this AAM goes up here, the jet stream tends to be more zonal and more progressive, faster. When the AAM is down here, it supports more of a amplification and more of a north-south orientation in the jet stream evolution. So we're moving back into that support for the rest of January and through much of February. Notice in the guidance towards the end of February, we head towards a neutral state. So this would suggest that the AAM would support a moderation and a return to possibly above normal temperatures by the time you get to the end of February. So again, this could still be a situation where through the middle of February, we are in this winter pattern. We return to the winter pattern. We return to the potential for cold air and storms. But then towards the end, we lose that. But again, this would change if we actually get a major stratospheric warming event. Then this all gets thrown out the window, okay? Because then this remains negative and deeply so. As far as the QBO state, let's see if I can pull up some of that data here. Let's see if I can find something new. Stratosphere. There we go. Okay, so right now our QBO went from a negative state to a positive state, but it's still in that range between minus 10 and plus 10, where it doesn't really inhibit the potential for high latitude blocking or negative or negative NAO pattern. But just so you understand, the state of the QBO does not force high latitude blocking. It just makes it more favorable, a more favorable environment for it to evolve. So right now, it's not really having too much of an impact on our pattern in terms of dictating where we're going. Do you see any factors indicating an extended winter that will last into early spring? It all is going to come down to what happens with the polar vortex. That's basically the bottom line. Interesting at 10 millibars, there is air that is actually above freezing on the edge of the polar vortex over Asia that looks like it is getting pulled up into the vortex. Looking at northern China and Japan area. Yeah, I mean, that is the beginning of our stratospheric warming. In fact, you can, let's see here, this one, which one is it? Here we are. What you're looking at is this evolution right here. Okay, so these are all potential stratospheric warming events that have failed. As you can see, the stratosphere in the higher latitudes is rather chilly. And now we're getting another punch. Now the question is whether this feature expands throughout all of northern hemisphere above 60 north. If that happens, that is your stratospheric warming event. Up to this point, what we've been dealing with are these ridges of warm air kind of punching at the polar vortex, stretching it, taunting it, trying to disrupt it. Okay? A stratospheric warming event is essentially taking a sledgehammer to it and breaking it apart. So the question is this a punch, or is this some guy slamming into it with a sledgehammer, breaking it apart? That's the primary question. So what is Judah's reasoning for a major stratospheric warming? I would suggest definitely going to his blog and reading it in depth, but I'll give you basically an idea. His support for it is waning. I will say that. He did mention that it's more likely that we just continue to see stretching of the polar vortex. But this evolution that we're watching here, if it reaches to the point of causing that disruption to stretch it enough to break the polar vortex, then you can get your stratospheric warming event. Rob says, evening, I'd like to consider right now about the half time of winter. Has there been anything that has surprised you compared to your winter forecast? For me, I've been surprised by the amount of cutters and the lack of negative NAL. Okay, the one thing that really surprised me was how much of an influence that first storm had on the whole pattern. It literally blew up the high latitude blocking that had developed going into mid-December. You looked at it going into, let's say when we're sitting here December 10th, we're looking at this powerful negative NAL block when we have Arctic air coming in and you have these short waves marching in. And the way in which the timing has been just a little bit off, and how much of an influence that has had on our winter pattern. What that did is that it didn't break the high latitude blocking, it displaced it. So as a result of the displacement, because of that first Arctic air mass and what it did to the whole pattern, it basically inhibited the potential for the tropospheric influences to help to disrupt the polar vortex, to keep it stretched and warped, and it inhibited our potential for seeing winter storms. And then by the time the polar vortex naturally consolidated, as it normally would after a stretching event, it basically shut down the Arctic air, and now we're in this cutter pattern. Now, the cutter pattern itself doesn't surprise me, because we all knew, and I said this several times, we will see periods of warm weather, moderate conditions, because typically in winters, I know there's this idea that we have perpetual cold air, but it just doesn't happen. It just never happens, okay? It's a myth. So the pattern itself doesn't surprise me. It's what happened in December and the way that we just missed major winter storms by just 3 hours constantly is what really has surprised me going into December. This warm pattern doesn't surprise me. What does surprise me is the way that the jet streak formed in the Pacific, which, like I said, is more like El Nino. That has surprised me. Are you surprised by the lack of Alberta clippers this winter? We had a couple of them in December, and then this pattern really wouldn't support a clipper pattern. I think we see that return in late January and the rest of February, though. Watching all these storms plowing into California is wild. What is the relationship with where the storms are entering the West Coast and the evolution on the East Coast? Okay, well, we'll go to this right here, and we'll go to the observations. So when this storm marches into the West Coast, it causes below normal heights here. So when you have below normal heights here, it causes heights to build here, kind of like a way for the pattern to balance out the movement of air. And so that keeps us warm. At the same time, when you have storm after storm moving into the West Coast, it's like a conveyor belt. So what happens is that any time that you start to see model guides trying to suggest a winter storm on the East Coast in this pattern, don't believe it. Because this constant train of storms basically kicks everything off to the east. It doesn't allow for timing for interaction of polar air masses. It doesn't allow for the timing to develop a storm, to pull cold air towards the coastal plain. All it does is support storms that either track west to east or track from the upper Midwest towards the Great Lakes. It doesn't support anything else other than that. So essentially, when you see storms marching in from California, you could kiss snow threats goodbye, at least until that ends. Storms crashing to the west coast has to stop. If it doesn't, winter is over regardless of other factors. The storms crashing into the west coast is due to that jet streak. This jet streak weakens and collapses, as we're starting to see. Then the storm threat ends. So that is what you kind of have the reasoning reversed. It's not the storms themselves that are inhibiting it. It's the pattern that's causing those storms. So it's kind of reverse thinking there. Kind of flip it, and then you're pretty much right. It would be nice if we built some new reservoirs in the past 50 years in California. Agreed. Many more people use word, no additional storage capacity, poster child for poor planning. Yeah, that's true. Let's see here. We're talking about California. Of course, without El Nino, it has been acting a lot like one, so we do not need to develop El Nino pattern this spring and summer. What causes that one storm to have so much of an influence on the pattern? Because the Arctic air was so impressive, it displaced the tropospheric polar vortex. Now, that displacement, what that did is that it displaced the EP flux influence. And so it gave the potential for, after that stretching came to an end, for it to consolidate faster. So here's what I was thinking in the pattern leading into early December. Okay, so we get the Arctic air come in, we have our negative NAO block, the first storm comes in, boom, winter storm, and then that sets up a 50-50 low, two more storms come underneath, active start to winter. Then we go into the pattern that we have now. This pattern that we have now, granted, I didn't think we'd have to see the polar jet stream the way we're seeing it right now in terms of strength, but I always liked the idea of a moderating period. Always did. That was always part of the forecast. What's causing the snowless idea is basically the missed opportunities in mid-December. So as you guys know, my mid-January idea, which essentially is now, was always that we'd have a mild period. That was always part of the forecast. So this part doesn't surprise me. It was the fact that first storm basically screwed up the potential for 2 or 3 other potential storms going forward that has caused a problem with the winter forecast so far. So the difference between a bunch of storms and a long stretch of winter weather along with shorter thaw is 4 hours and mistiming of the first storm. Essentially, yes. At least that's my opinion. Because that first storm would have set up the blocking for the next two. Remember the next 2 storms that marched through? Okay, so if that first storm materialized and you have a 50-50 low in place, then you have your cold air in place. It doesn't retract. And that was some pretty cold air in Christmas, right? So you have that very cold air. Let's say it moderates a little bit because cold air does. Then you have those first 2 other storms, but now they're dealing with a generally fresh Arctic air mass with a snowpack in place, by the way. And combine all that with a suppressed storm track, the second storm feeds into further blocking for the third storm. The third storm moves through, and then maybe we start to see relaxation. Polar vortex consolidates because that's what happens after stretching after 2 weeks. And then we end up in this mild pattern until we get our next period of stretching. So you see how that works. Is it possible that the last storm in the string of Pacific storms, as the pattern changes, will be able to serve the seeds for East Coast storms? Yeah, I mean, that's a possibility, yes. And let me check out what is going on in YouTube land. Let's see. I'm going to take the best question out of here. Let's see here. My grandma wants to cancel summer. Yeah, I agree. Let's see here. Will we have snow in January? I'd say if we have snow in January, it's going to be the last week of January. I think that's your best potential. How much longer will it go on this winter without snow? Let's see. Is this because of global warming? God, that's a complicated question. Okay. So, we definitely are dealing with warmer boundary layers. So if we were dealing with all marginal events, then that would certainly influence your snowfall potential. In terms of the pattern, I think there are several different factors impacting this particular winter pattern. To just connect it just to global warming from us, it negates all the other influences that we're dealing with, like from the volcano. So I think that is too simplistic to go from one point to the other point. But I do think it's a factor. Let's see. What are the best variables for winter storms with the La Nina winter and also for El Nino winters? Okay, so La Nina winters usually support, typically, because you have a weaker subtropical jet stream, more support from the polar jet stream, and you get a lot more of the Miller B type storms, where storms dive towards the Great Lakes or towards the Tennessee River Valley, and then redevelop off the Mid-Atlantic coast. And then that leads to significant precipitation on the coastal plain, but also leads to a lot of snow events where you miss out in southeastern Pennsylvania because you're in that dead zone between the transition of the old low and the new low, and it drives people in southeast Pennsylvania insane. This is why some people think that winter is quote-unquote extinct in southeast PA, because the past 4 winters have been primarily Miller B type storms. El Niños feature stronger subtropical jet streams and better interaction between the polar jet streams. So you can end up with more phasing events, more Miller A storms coming out of the Gulf of Mexico and heading right up the coast. That's where you can expect more widespread snowfall, more widespread precipitation events. Those storms tend to be more dynamic and are your traditional nor'easters. Strong La Ninas and strong El Ninos, both are bad news for snow lovers because it amplifies one jet stream over the other and causes mistiming of short waves, elimination of potential for high latitude blocking, and essentially creates a higher potential for warm air to flood in from the Pacific, kind of like what we're seeing right now. Weak La Ninas are more favorable for at least the inclusion of cold Arctic air coming in and interacting with a weak subtropical jet stream. Weak El Ninos are your best potential for above normal snowfall because they have a higher potential for phasing storms, but you also end up in the El Nino events more of a windshield wiper effect in terms of your temperatures. So it's variable. The key thing here is best to either have weak El Nino, weak La Nina, or a neutral event altogether. Let's see here. Could I say March will be colder than average? I could say that, but then I probably would be lying. I don't know yet, based on what we are looking at in the data. See, the whole thing with March, it's a pain in the neck forecast for March, because in March, you have such a wild swing from well below normal to well above normal that by the time you get done with doing the average by March 31st, you basically end up with the potential for above normal temperatures for the month average, but in reality, you went all over the place with your temperatures. So March is always a tough month for me to forecast. March and October are two very difficult months to forecast seasonally. Yes, I hate the hot weather. Canceling summer is a great idea. I second it. There you go. Blizzard 1996 and Storm March 1993 are perfect examples of Miller A storms. Exactly. And for all you guys in Southeast PA, what you guys want going forward, if you want to see winter return, so to speak, is, at least for your area, is a string of Miller A storms. Because the reason why is because then you don't have to worry about when the storm transitions from the, let's say, from West Virginia to the Delaware coast. When that happens, the reason why you guys keep on missing out is because there's this transfer of energy, so to speak, and you guys are caught in the middle of it. And so as a result, you'll notice every time your precipitation shield over you dies, but it picks up in southern New Jersey and right around Philadelphia. But then the western suburbs of Philadelphia gets nothing but flurries because you're in that dead zone. So it's very difficult to forecast for that. And then it picks up in northeast PA and around Trenton, but then you miss out. So that's why winter, it seems like it's dead for you, because you keep on getting these Miller B storms. So what you want is a Miller A storm where you don't have to deal with that transition. You just get a slug of moisture moving in towards your location with cold air in place, and everyone's happy. Well, unless you have to move the snow, then you're not so happy. Okay. So we are already almost at 9 o'clock. I could tell I'm starting to lose my voice a little bit. But excellent questions tonight, guys. So the story tonight is this. Winter is not canceled. Those that do cancel it they might be in for a bit of a surprise the rest of the way. I'm pretty confident in the idea of a colder weather pattern returning for late January through mid-February. I don't know whether that means we'll all see snow, but I do know that I'm going to be busier than what I am right now with this progressive Pacific pattern. I think that will return towards, at the very least, more seasonable temperatures, potential for below normal temperatures, and we're going to have to really keep an eye on where that Siberian air mass goes, because where it goes, it could rival to what we saw around Christmas time around here in terms of cold temperatures. I do like the idea of a pattern that is favorable for winter storms returning, but I just want to stress, I want to make it very clear, I can't guarantee it. I know that's what people want to hear. Are we going to have snow? And I can't guarantee it, because I recognize what the pattern is, and what it is another scenario where the short waves have to interact. If they do, the first storm sets up the blocking for the other storms that follow. If it misses, then you have to wait for that first storm to connect. So when the first storm connects, that sets up the potential for winter storm patterns after that. And until I see that connection, until we get to that point, it is unwise to make any guarantees beyond that. So I'm confident of colder weather. I'm confident of more active weather. I'm not confident of whether or not that leads to snow in your backyard. So that's essentially where we are at right now. Outstanding chat tonight, guys. Thank you again for joining. I really, really appreciate it. You guys have a wonderful evening. And as always, let me go back here. Stay safe out there.